welcome back. We're going to be taking a look at a few games from the States Cup. When I initially heard about the States Cup, I got very excited, and in collaboration with another Florida Chess Board member, Matthew Colts, we contacted a bunch of our friends and colleagues in Florida Chess, and we put together a team. And what better way to show support for a state versus state team battle in the style of Amateur South, where the 4 players on the team's average rating needs to be under 2200, than by playing yourself. So I jumped in week 1 against my home state, Alabama, and I'd like to take a look at a few of these games. So let's go ahead and jump right in. And where I would like to start is talking about the concept of preparation, because I chose an opening based off of looking at my opponent's games on lichess.org, where the matches are played. And when seeing that he's a 1e4 player, I was noticing across the board that he favored what I would describe as more simple positions. Like, he just wants to get to a playable middle game / end game with just simple chess. And you're not going to see any nasty open Sicilians, for instance, from this type of guy. This type of player is characteristically going to play openings which you can get to move 15 or so without really having to know too much theory. So when I typically face this type of player, I'm going to offer a line that can get extreme complications, but knowing their style, they're probably going to go for something simple, and that can get you hurt playing against many lines. So I chose 1d6, and that's going to be a perk. But it'll evolve. So d4, good, take the center. We can all appreciate that. Knight f6, bothering the c-pawn. And right here, this is a move that I had learned from Grandmaster Akobian. He uses the check perk or check system quite often when playing against lower rated players, and it gets dynamic and interesting positions. There are a number of different lines for white to choose from, and I covered the entire opening on the Palm Beach Chess and Patreon. But here it's important. If you are an e4 player, I feel that you can play completely solid like my opponent did in the game, but you absolutely must know the most critical variation. And when a strong player is preparing to play against you, if I'm seeing that you're playing non-theoretical lines, I'm going to go for a theoretical line. So always be prepared. And my opponent went with 4 knight f3, which I feel is not the most dynamic approach, but we'll look at the most critical line that white can play from this move order. I think much more critical is going to be f4 with the Austrian attack style play, and black plays queen a5 in the main line, and bishop d3, and e5, and we have ourselves, interesting and dynamic game. Another line to choose from would be f3, where white's plan of development can be quite simple. Bishop e3, queen d2, castle queenside, and you can begin to throw pawns on the king side. And we see this often in both of these lines in the perk proper. So what makes this different is that we're typically not going to fianchetto our bishop in these lines. We're waiting to see with c6. We're keeping the pawn structure fluid in order to have the idea that we could play e5 and go back into, say, a Philidor type structure. After knight f3, bishop g4, and so far the structure is still very fluid. And I want to go ahead and talk about the plan that black has, the dream. I want to be able to play e6, d5, and when white goes e5, eventually play c5 after saving the knight. And what I want you to notice with this pawn structure is that is a French defense. Problem of the French defense is typically our bishop is sealed in, his flavor is sealed in on c8. Well, with the bishop outside of the chain, this is a drastically improved version of a French defense. So white needs to play very, very actively here. And the best move, according to theory, is h3, and then queen e2, actually, where you have ideas like g4 and castling queenside. So this is the critical line if you're going to play 4 knight f3 against the check perk, and you gotta know it. My opponent played bishop e3, and at this point I already felt very, very good about my chances in the game, as this was what he had played in the past in this position. And my opponent had a little bit against him going into this game because he was rushing to make it to the game, and we actually started the game, I want to say 15 minutes late or so. So when you feel rushed, you're going to play quickly, and you're going to fall back on safe patterns in order to try to make up time. So that leads more towards you're just falling directly into preparation at that point. So another micro lesson can be learned from there is you got to keep your emotions in check. If you're late for a game, don't let that affect your game. Don't let off the board distractions affect your level of play. So I begin my plan here. E6, bishop e7, we get castled, and castling kingside also helps my feelings in the position as well, because if he castled queenside, he's of course got much greater attacking chances. Now I get d5 in, and we have our fixed French structure. So now it's talking about understanding the plan. Now when you castle kingside in a French, typically this bishop is going to be on c8. You have the ability to move this knight out of the way, say knight e1, and then you're going to go f4, f5, and you have yourself an attack. So we look at the three wings of the board. The center, it's locked. We're not playing in the center. An attack on the wings must occur when the center is completely locked, as such. So white's plan is to play for this f4, f5 break. Black's plan is to play for a c5 break. There is nothing preventing me from getting my natural break, and with the knights located where they're at, it's preventing natural play for white. I can't play c3 to shore up the structure in the center, and I can't play f4 because as soon as this knight moves, I'm able to trade off my bad bishop for your good one, which will limit attacking chances in the future. So ideally, white would want this bishop here, this knight here, my bishop to be back home on c8 to be able to play f4, f5. And that's simply just not going to happen. So here really magnified the problems in the position for white, because my rationale is typically my bishop is terrible on c8. So if I take here, this puts the bishop in the way, slowing down the potential of the counterplay with f4, f5 eventually. So I'm not going to waste any time. I'm going to go ahead and hit the middle. And already it's becoming very difficult for white to hold everything together here. Say a move like knight e2 could very well weaken these pawns too much. Whereas if bishop takes, we get a position similar to what's going to occur in the main game. So we'll go ahead with that. After knight c6, I felt g3 is a move which says, I just want to move my bishop back and get the f4 counterplay. So I see that my opponent's going to have this counterplay, and this was really my first think in the game, because we're out of opening prep at this point. And I say to myself, okay, if I just give white time here, he's going to play bishop g2, f4, g4, f5, and get his natural counterplay. But I do have the ability to liquidate here. If the queens come off the board, he will never have an attack, and he still has a very weak pawn structure. So I decide to liquidate. And bishop c5 is also a critical move here, but understanding my opponent based off of his previous games that I looked at, he really enjoys simplified positions. And it's a bad habit that I've seen when there's a mismatch in rating, and in this case, my opponent's about 2000 USCF, some players will trade down far too much. You got to keep complications in order to win. A puncher always has a chance. So when he trades queens, this is already a technically winning position for black. Black has no problems, clear targets, and I can just slowly improve the position. And after bishop g2, this is the critical move that pretty much is the beginning of the end for white. Making this transition into a knight versus bishop ending. This bishop b4, essentially white can resign. It's that bad. The move that I had considered in the game for white, I feel like you have to try rook e3 here. And it sets a subtle trap that if black's not careful, if you try a move like d4, rook e4 is actually quite good. So, but after rook e3, knight c4, and that's all she wrote. So after bishop b4, rook e to d1, and I don't miss the opportunity to fix the weakness. Now the rest of the game is a bit of a clinic on exploiting the weakness in the position. So rooks are designed to go to open files, so let's do that. We'll get everybody working together. Gotta love the piece harmony. So white's rooks are purely defensive. So let's go ahead and bother the c-pawn some more. And then also, you have that potential threat to win the exchange. Now, when you have an advantage, there's absolutely no rush here. I could take the c-pawn, but when this knight moves, I'm going to be losing a pawn in turn. So simply defend the knight, defend the pawn, and get that Karpovian squeeze on your opponent, because why not? So bishop f1, again, this weakness is not going anywhere in the position, so I'm just going to shore up the pawn structure, no problems. White's got to make a move, and things begin to unravel. Bishop d3 defends the pawn, and there's multiple lines here that win at this point for black, but this is definitely one of those human moves. Like, the computer's like, rook a3, knight c5, just win. And I see these ideas, but g6 is a feel-good move. g6 is, I'm not going to get back rank mated, I have no problems, and no matter what you do, I'm still going to have either knight c5 or rook a3 on the subsequent move. So this is just that feel-good human move. So king f1, now knight c5, and it's a practical consideration here, like rook a3 or knight c5. Knight c5 is going to guarantee that I can force the trade of the minor piece, the only imbalance in the position, and then I'm just simply going to be up in a winning rook and pawn endgame. So depending upon which engine you ask, they'll argue over which move is better. But I think from a practical standpoint, the game's not going to last as long if you play knight c5 to try to trade down into this winning ending. King d2, and I end up getting rook a3 anyway. And now the pawns march on. a5. And already this is getting to the point to where we have some interesting variations. And like, there's certain rules in endgames. Like, if you are not 100% sure and can't see the win or understand the win, don't trade down. Because rook a3 does win, but you have to be very, very sure when trading down into a king and pawn endgame that you're winning. I typically have that rule of never trade off the last rook. Especially when I know and understand that this rook and pawn ending is a win. So g5 is what I played in the main game. And the idea is that my king is going to be able to have a route into the game later, no matter what. So this is a strong practical move, and I can follow up with rook a3 at some point, being assured that white's not going to make a pawn chain in some way that's going to keep my king locked out. So why this move is significant. So if f4 is played, I'll be able to grab, and then my king has a direct path. If g4 is played, I'll be able to play f6, and my king's going to have a direct path into the game. One way or another, after g5, I will be able to enter the game on the king side of the board and start collecting pawns. So understanding this, simple move is important. So I take no risk in playing that move, but the engine shows rook a3 also wins here. King d4 is going to be the better practical move, where again, g5, same ideas as before, but rook takes a3. And I found this position very interesting because in my initial calculations of the board, I had missed this next move, a4. And it's beautiful when the pawns, we rarely see this type of motif in chess where the king can't do anything against these pawns, because if he tries to approach, the pawn runs. And all he can do is really sit and wait for the position to improve. And understanding how to get the king into the game, h5, so we can lock it down. And this is great because after king g7, white's actually in zug here. There's nothing he can do. He's made all the pawn moves that he can, and we've allowed him to lock up the position and get us out, because any king move is going to result in push and queen. So it's that would have been a very, very nice way to end this one in zug, but what can you do? You can't always play the nicest win, but g5, decent practical move. And as a note, if g4 is played, we have this same idea again, and f6, as I spoke about before, where our king has a direct route into the game, and there's nothing that white can do. So lastly, in the main game, f4 was played, and we'll see that I do not miss the opportunity. c3 is played, so now rook a3. He's got to worry about the passer, and as he does, I collect, and my opponent had had enough after f5, as he does not have sufficient counterplay to justify continue playing, and the f-pawn, as we say, it's a girl. And that'll do it for Game 1 of the States Cup. Hopefully you enjoyed it.